Hello everyone, welcome to History 2001, Launching America. In this video, we will be discussing the first inhabitants of what will become known as the United States of America. We will consider the first humans to arrive in the Americas, who are commonly referred to as Native Americans or Indians today. After we have discussed the America's first inhabitants, we will discuss how these people established the cultures that encountered European explorers during the Age of Exploration in the late 1400s Common Era. So who were the first people who came to the Americas? How did they get here? What was their culture like? These are all questions that we're going to tackle in the next few slides. Most scholars believed that the ancestors of modern-day Native Americans arrived on the North American continent between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago. Some people believe that America's first humans arrived as early as 20,000 to 40,000 years ago, but the majority of these people, called Paleo Indians by scholars, arrived during the later set of dates that I just mentioned. Why did the Paleo Indians come to the Americas when they did? About 15,000 years ago, the Earth was in the midst of the last great ice age. A great ice age occurs when the global temperature drops so low that the Earth's far northern and southern hemispheres will experience severe glaciation. That is, they will be covered with glaciers. These glaciers in the western hemisphere extended as far south as present-day Ohio. It is important to note that Earth has also experienced countless mini ice ages, which have a much smaller effect on the global climate, but can have a significant impact on the development of human cultures and civilizations. Anyway, back to the Paleo Indians. As a side effect of increased glaciation, the global sea level was far lower than it is today. In Eastern Asia, present-day Russia and Siberia, was connected to what is now Alaska via a land bridge called Beringian, but is currently covered in water by the present-day Bering Straits. These Paleo Indians probably walked across Beringian, but some scholars think that they may have used canoes or other primitive boats as well, allowing them to travel more quickly and easily. The relative ease at which humans could travel over water before the development of steam power and internal combustion engines will be a major theme in this course, so keep this point in mind as we go forward. Some scholars have proposed an alternate explanation for how the America's first people came here. They propose that the America's first human residents came from what is now Europe using small boats. This explanation is called the Solutrean hypothesis. Scholars who advocate for the Solutrean hypothesis argue that the first humans to arrive in the Americas used spear points that bore similarities to those used by the Solutrean culture that inhabited what is now Western Europe between 21,000 and 17,000 years ago. This hypothesis has not been confirmed by genetic discoveries, as human remains have not been found in the same layers of Earth strata as the spear points. So the most evidence-based descriptions for the origins of America's first people remains the Beringian explanation we discussed previously. We will move forward in this course, assuming that the Beringian explanation is true. So what were the Paleo Indians, the people who came to the Americas via Siberia, actually like? Scholars think that they were not a single monolithic group, and that they came over in waves over the course of a few thousand years. They also think that these disparate Paleo Indian groups may have spoken different languages, and that they would have had different physical appearances and skin tones, although most scholars agree, based on genetic studies of Paleo Indian remains, that these people generally had dark eyes, black hair, and a copper-colored skin tone, like most modern-day Native Americans. Scholars also agree that these migrations stopped roughly 10,000 years ago with the end of the last great ice age, the melting of the glaciers, and the subsequent rise in sea level, flooding the Beringian land bridge. A good example of what the average Paleo Indian might have looked like can be found in the study of the Kennewick Man, a roughly 9,000-year-old human skeleton found in present-day Washington state in 1996. An international team of scientists completed genetic profiles and forensic anthropological studies on the Kennewick man's remains and were able to recreate how he would have looked when he was alive. Notice his dark hair and eyes and his ruddy skin tone. The scientists determined that the Kennewick man had DNA that coincided primarily with modern Native Americans, as well as some East Asians, including the Ainu people, who used to inhabit Japan's northern islands. After genetic tests were completed, it was determined that the Kennewick man was closely related to modern-day Native Americans. Thus, the U.S. government gave custody of the remains to several Native American tribes living in modern-day Washington, who laid Kennewick man to rest according to their own rituals in 2017. Now we will talk a little more about what kind of technologies the Paleo Indians brought with them to the Americas, and how these techs evolved over time to become important parts of the lifeways of many different Native American cultures. The Paleo Indians were hunter-gatherers, meaning they gained their subsistence by hunting wild game, fishing, and collecting wild fruits and vegetables. To this end, the Paleo Indians practiced a seasonal, semi-nomadic migration style, following the herds in the seasons. When many people hear the term hunter-gatherer today, they think of primitive, antediluvian cultures that cannot compete with more sedentary agricultural societies, the so-called civilizations. What scholars have found, however, is that these supposedly primitive hunter-gatherer societies were actually very well organized, and that their technology, for the time, was very adaptable and sophisticated, using natural resources that were readily available in the environments in which these people lived. For example, consider the spear points made by Paleo Indians, particularly those of the Clovis culture. These points were sharp, perfect for killing large game like bison and now extinct woolly mammoths, camels, and giant armadillos and sloths, all of which died off due to the end of the last great ice age about 10,000 years ago in the Americas. The climate of the Americas during the great ice age was probably more diverse than it is today, with arid deserts, damp rainforests, and cold tundra existing in close proximity, in what some scholars call a plaid environment. Points like those found amongst the Clovis culture have been found across what is now the U.S., and even as far south as Chile and South America, attesting to the popularity and utility of these tools in the harsh environments of the Americas. Paleo Indians and their Native American descendants also used sophisticated traps to capture and slow down wild game as well, allowing them to go in for the kill, as you can see on this slide with the hunting of the woolly mammoth. As the Paleo Indians expanded across North and South America, they began to develop new lifeways and survival techniques suited to the environments in which they had settled. Native Americans' numbers grew significantly over time. It is estimated by the year 1500 of the Common Era, 8 years after Columbus's first voyage, the indigenous population of North and South America had reached nearly 55 million people. The vast majority of these people lived in Mesoamerica and the Andes Mountains. The region that includes what is now the U.S. and Canada was less densely settled and probably had a population of about 3.8 million. In 1500, North and South America had a population density of about 3 people per square mile. To put this into perspective, Europe in 1500, with a population of about 62 million people, was more densely populated, with about 16 people per square mile. Indigenous populations across all of the Americas would decline steeply after the arrival of Europeans, due to disease, warfare, exploitation, and dispossession. But we will discuss these issues in later videos. The regional cultural adaptations made by the descendants of the Paleo Indians would give rise to the diverse Native American cultures that encountered the European explorers in the 1400s and 1500s. One of the most important developments in these early Native American cultures was the adoption of agriculture, primarily through the domestication of corn, or as it was originally called, maize. Maize was first domesticated about 7,000 years ago in Mesoamerica, roughly in what is now Mexico. For perspective, Neolithic people in the Old World began practicing agriculture about 10,000 years ago, which is only slightly earlier than the Paleo Indians in the grand scheme of human history. Mesoamerican hunter-gatherers discovered that the teosinte grass produced edible seeds, and through selective breeding, these people became farmers, breeding the teosinte that produced the largest seed pods, eventually giving rise to the corn we know today, roughly. Corn cobs, some of which are as small as strawberries, have been found in caves in Mexico, dating to about 4,000 years before the Common Era. Maize domestication is spread north to what would become the United States, first in the American Southwest, roughly what is now Arizona, about 4,000 years ago. It arrived in the eastern U.S. about 1,500 years ago, although some scholars debate these dates. In addition to maize, which formed the bedrock of Native American agriculture, America's indigenous peoples domesticated over 100 other plant species. In the Andes Mountains, the ancestors of the Incan peoples domesticated potatoes between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago, and the peoples of Mesoamerica domesticated chili peppers and tomatoes 6,000 and 600 years ago, respectively. The most important agricultural productions to Native Americans, after maize corn, were gourds and beans. Gourds, including squash, were domesticated before corn, probably about 10,000 years ago, and beans were domesticated much later, perhaps around 2000 BCE. Both of these plants were first domesticated in the Andes and Mesoamerica, and spread north to what would become the U.S. The Native Americans of the Midwest, namely the Cahokian people who inhabited the Mississippi River Valley, were one of the first progenitors of Three Sisters planting, a type of companion agriculture in which farmers grew maize, squash, and beans together in the same fields. Corn, while a critical cereal grain for Native Americans, depleted the soil of nitrogen, a critical mineral that plants needed in order to grow properly. Beans added nitrogen back to the soil, allowing Native American farmers to farm their fields without having to leave them fallow without cultivation, to regenerate their nutrients, as is done in cultures that practice one-crop agriculture. Additionally, corn, while easily stored and high in carbohydrates, does not provide a balanced diet when eaten alone. It is low in protein and fatty acids, and lacks critical nutrients like niacin. Beans and squash, however, made up for the corn's shortfalls, allowing Native American agriculturalists who used the Three Sisters method of planting to be far healthier than societies which did not, as testified by studies done on human remains from Native American cultures. Although agriculture offered many benefits, not all Native American peoples took up intensive farming. Some chose to stick to time-honored hunter-gatherer subsistence models. The societies that did adopt agriculture, however, developed very differently from their hunter-gatherer neighbors. As was the case in the Old World, agriculture created food surpluses. Cereal grains, while low in certain nutrients, could be grown fairly easily and could be stored for future use, creating resource surpluses. As was also the case in the Old World, these surpluses allowed agricultural societies to specialize, as not everyone in that community had to dedicate all of their time to the procurement of food, as is necessary in hunter-gatherer societies. A few skilled farmers could feed an entire community, allowing their neighbors to specialize in other skills, becoming builders, warriors, priests, or artisans. Those who secured the food resources and issued them to the people would become the Native American community's elite classes, giving rise to what scholars have called civilization. When I say the word civilization, You probably think of a society that is refined, innovative, and cultured. You might conjure up images of quote-unquote advanced and sophisticated societies. Perhaps you think of quote-unquote Western civilizations, like the ancient Greeks or Romans. Or maybe you think of the US civilization, with its scientific and cultural achievements. What I am proposing is a more broad definition of civilization. A society or people group becomes a civilization when it has the resources and division of labor to create things like monumental architecture and fine arts, when it can establish cities, develop religions, and exhibit social hierarchies. Cultures that have achieved one or more of these things are deemed civilized. By this definition, many Native American cultures achieved civilization. They developed agricultural techniques that allowed for the saving of resources, and they used those resources to build architecture of a monumental nature and to create divisions of labor and eventually social stratification. It is also worth noting that while civilizations are able to achieve great things, there are many downsides to living in a civilization versus living in a hunter-gatherer society. In a civilization, social hierarchies exist in a way that they cannot in hunter-gatherer societies, and economic inequality tends to worsen over time as the elite accumulates more resources in civilizations. One of the greatest technological developments of civilizations, written language, was developed to help the elite collect taxes and resources from the commoners in exchange for protection and administration. Some Native American cultures, like the Aztecs, Inca, and Maya, developed written languages for this purpose, as well as the propagation of their culture. The Native American peoples of North America, although they achieved civilization, did not use written languages like their neighbors in Central and South America. Life could be very difficult for lower class people in these Native American civilizations. Anthropological evidence, studies done on their skeletal remains, suggest that the poor had hard lives. Their bones show they suffer from malnutrition, arthritis, and joint damage from a life of hard work, as well as wounds sustained in battle. So, civilization offered Native Americans many of the same benefits that it offered peoples of the Old World, but it also presented many of the same drawbacks. With this knowledge of civilizations in mind, let's consider some of North America's largest and most representative Native American cultures, those that utilized civilization and those that did not. In the North American Southwest, the first place that maize was domesticated, Indian tribes developed an agricultural system that adapted to the aridity of the southwestern climate. One of the ways they did this was through the construction of irrigation networks. Using these networks, they grew maize and other crops in the river valleys. The women of these societies oversaw agriculture, and the men of these societies oversaw hunting and warfare, a common gender-based division of labor across many North American societies. The Southwestern Indians developed a religious belief system that venerated the sky and the earth. They saw the sky with its rain as masculine, and the earth, in which they tilled their seed, as feminine. Southwestern peoples, like the Anasazi, the ancestors of modern Zuni and Navajo tribes, achieved a high level of civilization, building secure cliffside settlements, or pueblos, that while difficult to construct, were highly defensible, allowing them to protect their people and their food resources. For example, the pueblo of Chaco Canyon, present-day New Mexico, required over 30,000 tons of sandstone bricks in its construction, attesting to the Anasazi's keen ability to gather resources to feed their workers and divert labor from food production to construction. This is the Mesa Verde site. It's in present-day Colorado. It was inhabited by the Anasazi/ancestral Puebloan people. You can see the types of buildings built in this settlement. You can also see its strategic value as well, being built into a high cliff, which would have given the inhabitants of this city a line of sight to see enemies approaching, and also would have allowed them to defend themselves, their families, and then their possessions. Here is an aerial shot of the Chaco Canyon site in present-day New Mexico. It was inhabited from about the 800s to about the 1100s AD or CE, Common Era. And this shot really shows the size of the site, but also the sophistication of the ancestral Puebloan builders who built Chaco Canyon. Here is a close-up of a round courtyard at the Chaco Canyon site. These courtyards would have been used by the inhabitants of Chaco Canyon as a place to gather, to trade goods amongst each other. These courtyards may have also been used for religious rituals as well, similar to kibas. Here are some close-ups of doorways and the stonework used at Chaco Canyon. The builders of Chaco Canyon basically used dry stone technology, fitting stones together with smaller stones, rather than using bricks and mortar like other civilizations did. So you can see there's a high level of sophistication in the architecture used by the ancestral Puebloan builders of Chaco Canyon. These are some drinking vessels that were found around the Chaco Canyon site. You can see the decorations on these cups to make them more aesthetically pleasing. You can also see that they have traces of cacao or chocolate, which was imported, of course, from Mesoamerica. Cacao does not grow in the American Southwest. So these cups not only reveal a level of artistic sophistication on the part of the people of Chaco Canyon, but also they had extensive trade networks, particularly with people to the south, allowing them to have luxury goods like chocolate brought in. Here is what the cups looked like as they were being excavated from the Chaco Canyon archaeological site. Here's a close-up of another example of Chaco Canyon pottery. This artifact shows once again the sophistication of Chaco Canyon art, but also variety as well. The pattern's a little bit different on this piece of pottery than on the ones looked at on previous slides. These are some beads recovered from near the Chaco Canyon site. They're made of turquoise, a mineral that's readily available in the North American Southwest, but is also available in Mesoamerica. And there is some debate as to whether these beads were imported from Central America or if they were made locally using local materials. It's also possible that the turquoise could have been imported from the South and then locally manufactured into beads. Anthropologists debate the role of beads in ancestral Puebloan and Chaco Canyon society. They may have been used for adornment, for artistic purposes, but if we engage in what is called comparative ethnography, studying different cultures to see their similarities, we come to the conclusion that these beads may have also been used for spiritual purposes as well. Other Native American peoples use beads for spiritual purposes, and it seems likely that the people of Chaco Canyon would have also used beads in their religious and spiritual rituals. And this shows differences, but also commonalities in Native American cultures. Here are some more examples of ancestral Puebloan material culture. You can see the pottery is decorated with what we might call southwestern patterns today. These sort of geometric designs, very sophisticated, A lot of variety in these designs as well. We also see that there are arrowheads and spear points. These are societies that were prepared to defend themselves in various ways, not only with weapons, but in how they built their fortified settlements. Turquoise, of course, is used in the material culture of the ancestral Puebloan southwestern Native American cultures. We have devices used to grind corn. Corn, of course, is grown in the American Southwest, as it is in other parts of the Americas. And then we have some footwear used by ancestral Puebloan people. This is different than the moccasins worn by other Native American groups. These pieces of footwear were made from grasses and plant materials rather than animal materials. Here is a close-up of what we think are the soles of southwestern Native American shoes or sandals. You can see they're made of woven grasses, and these were probably not made to last for long periods of time. These were probably meant to be fairly inexpensive shoes that would be replaced as they wore out. Weapons have been found near and within ancestral Puebloan sites like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Bows and arrows, arrowheads have been found. These would have been used not only for things like hunting, but also for defense as well. We know these societies faced military threats, which we'll talk about later in this video. While the Anasazi built spectacular settlements, their dependence on agriculture made them vulnerable to changes in the climate, which, combined with threats from other warring Native Americans, caused their culture to disappear around the year 1300 of the Common Era. The Anasazi's reliance on agriculture actually made them, in some ways, more vulnerable than hunter-gatherer societies, which could have migrated to regions with more abundant food resources in a time of climate change. Further to the east, Native Americans of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys developed their own form of civilization. These peoples established settlements around high, man-made earth mounds. These large mounds, as seen at a variety of sites in the eastern U.S., attest to these cultures' ability to save resources and mobilize their people for large construction projects. One of the oldest and largest of these mounds was built at Poverty Point in what is now Louisiana. Poverty Point's bird mound, a massive avian-shaped earthwork, is over 72 feet high. It was built around 1400 BCE. Further to the north and east, in our neck of the woods, the Hopewell people built their own large mounds. The Hopewell's most famous mound, which is in Newark, Ohio, was built between 100 BCE and 400 CE. The Hopewell constructed the Newark earthworks as a ceremonial and religious site, where the people would gather at certain times of the year to measure the paths of the sun and the moon, and to bury their honored dead as well. This site was not continuously settled. The Hopewell religion put a high emphasis on ancestor worship and reverence for the dead. The Hopewell made intricate mica and hammered copper artwork for trade and to bury with their deceased, whose remains they carried with them until they could be interred in burial mounds around the Newark earthworks. The Hopewell were a semi-nomadic people that focused on trading and traveling by water, but they adopted maize agriculture toward the end of their civilization's existence. Here are some examples of Hopewell material culture, specifically Hopewell pipe stems. These are very intricate carved pipe stems. Tobacco was used by the Hopewell people in spiritual rituals, so it makes sense that they would want to decorate the vessels and tools they use to smoke tobacco. These are decorated with birds, and they're made from pipestone from the northern Midwest, roughly what is now Minnesota. So this is pretty far from the Hopewell heartland in Ohio, and it's a testament to the trade networks in the Hopewell interaction sphere. Here are some additional examples of Hopewell and later Fort Ancient material culture. We can see the mica hands made by the Hopewell people. Mica, of course, is a stone or a mineral that does not come from the Midwest. It comes more from the southeast, the Appalachian region. This is once again evidence of the Hopewell's ability to trade with people across North America. It also shows some of the stability of Hopewell society, that there was time and expertise to create these very sophisticated hand artifacts and other types of artifacts. The Hopewell had the resources not only to purchase these materials, but then to make them into these artifacts. And later civilizations like the Fort Ancient will make artifacts as well, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Here's a map illustrating where the Hopewell got some of their materials. As you can see, there's mica mentioned on the previous slide. It comes from the southeast, from the Appalachian region. There's also obsidian coming from the Rocky Mountains, showing how far to the west the Hopewell were able to trade and interact with people. Also, we find shark teeth in some of the Hopewell's artifacts, showing that they had connections with people on both the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast. The Hopewell also had access to copper from the northern Midwest, what would now be the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, etc. The Hopewell worked metal. They could be considered a metal-working civilization, but they did not melt down metal. They did not smelt metal. They worked the metal cold into objects rather than melting it down as other civilizations did. Around the year 1000 of the Common Era, the mound-building civilizations collapsed and were replaced by the more militant Mississippian culture, which, instead of mounds, focused on building large earth pyramids. The Mississippian pyramid builders, including the Fort Ancient culture, which replaced the Hopewell, and the Cahokian people, who built a settlement at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, were more warlike than their predecessors. The Cahokia and the Fort Ancient used new technologies, like the bow and arrow, to overwhelm the more peaceful mound builders, who used less powerful atlatls to defend themselves. Human remains from the period attest to the Mississippians' keen military strength. Here are some examples of Fort Ancient material culture. The Fort Ancient would have used pottery, like that seen on the left-hand side of this slide, to store maize, corn. And these resource surpluses would have allowed the Fort Ancient culture to be able to subsist warriors for longer periods of time, allowing their society to become more militaristic. And the Mississippian people would have taken a similar approach to resource surpluses. They could have supported larger militaries, and also resources surpluses would have allowed the people of Cahokia to build much larger earth pyramids than the smaller mounds built by the earlier mound building civilizations. Here are some examples of reconstructions of Fort Ancient settlements. This is a modern reconstruction on the right-hand side of this slide. On the left-hand side of the slide is an artist's rendering of a Fort Ancient settlement. These settlements would be built on hills, and they would be built with walls. The Fort Ancient people and others around them needed to be able to defend their settlements from attacks, showing how the civilizations that replaced the Hopewell were more militaristic, more warlike. They needed to be able to defend themselves from attacks. Additionally, Mississippians like the Cahokia and the Fort Ancient were far more sedentary than the mound builders. The Mississippians constructed large, permanently settled, fortified cities near the earthen pyramids that they built. In contrast, the mound builders had been semi-nomadic and would only congregate at their ceremonial earthworks at certain times of the year to trade and bury their dead. The Mississippians were sedentary enough to build large cities, and their social systems bore a strong resemblance to the class hierarchies of the Native Americans of Mesoamerica, namely the Maya and the Aztecs. Here is a piece of two-dimensional artwork from a Mississippian site. You can see the similarities in the art style between the Mississippians and Mesoamerican civilizations with whom they traded to the south. On the other side of the slide is a modern artistic recreation of what a Mississippian or Cahokian warrior would have looked like. He's armed with a spear and with a club that is inset with shark teeth to make it sharper and more deadly. Keep in mind that the Mississippian and Cahokian peoples were much more warlike than their predecessors. Here are some additional examples of material culture found in and around Mississippian sites. We find things like arrowheads and spearheads. This is a atlatl or spear thrower. This is a modern reproduction, modern replica. The arrow or spear would be fit into these insets here, and then the thrower would grasp the atlatl from the handle to throw the spear much faster than they would throw the spear just using their own arm. Of course, atlatls are more difficult to use and they're less powerful than bows and arrows. The Mississippians practiced agriculture, built cities and pyramids, fought wars, and practiced large-scale human sacrifice as well. The Mississippian elite used human sacrifice as a tool to motivate the commoners to fight in their wars and to keep the people from toppling the rule of the upper class by distracting them with the spectacle of the sacrifices. Evidence suggests that the Mississippian elite looked down on their own people, referring to the commoners as stinkards, much like the Mesoamerican elite, who also demeaned their underclass. This is an aerial shot of a earth pyramid near the Cahokia site. These massive pyramids, of course, could not have been built without the labor of the underclass, the so-called stinkards, who served the upper classes in Mississippian society. This dot here is an automobile passing by to give you an idea of just how large these pyramids are and how important the labor of the underclass, the so-called stinkards, was to building the Mississippian society. The Mississippian fine art was heavily influenced by Mesoamerica as well, with jaguars and falcons being common motifs in their artwork, as was common in the Mayan and Aztec cultures as well. Additionally, like their Hopewell predecessors, the Mississippians worked copper, but they did not smelt metal. The peoples of Mesoamerica, in contrast to the Mississippians, practiced metallurgy, the smelting of metal, and they developed written language, also something the Mississippians did not do. By the 1500s, the Mississippian culture had begun to decline due to internecine warfare and diseases that had been unwittingly introduced by the first waves of European colonizers. Several modern Native American nations, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Osage peoples, claim the Mississippians as their ancestors, although their cultures are quite different from their forebears, leading some 19th century Euro-Americans to believe a people distinct from Native Americans had built the earthen monuments that dotted the American heartland. Again, here are some examples of Mississippian material culture. You can see copper artifacts. Remember, the Mississippians worked copper, but they did not smelt copper like the Mesoamericans did. But there are certain stylistic similarities and themes used by the Mississippians that were also used by Mesoamericans. The Mississippians also used tobacco, and they created pipes. This pipe is of a snake. There's pipes of eagles and birds. just to show the sophistication of Mississippian artwork. This sophistication, of course, comes as a result of resource surpluses, and I would argue social stratification allows for the development of artisan classes who would have created these artifacts. And of course, you can see the similarities between Mesoamerican artifacts and Mississippian artifacts in the animals that are portrayed, jaguars, eagles, etc., and how humans are portrayed as well. The proportions used by Mesoamerican artists, artisans, sculptors, etc., are similar to the styles used by Mississippian artists, suggesting a kind of cross-pollination of ideas, an exchange of ideas between the Mesoamerican and Mississippian peoples. On North America's northeast coast, the eastern Woodlands peoples developed lifeways that combine elements of the hunter-gatherer culture and agricultural civilization. The eastern Woodland peoples, ancestors of modern Native American groups like the Algonquin and the Iroquois, hunted in the region's woodlands, fished in rivers and along the coast, and gathered wild plants as well. They also practiced agriculture, including the Three Sisters method. It should be noted that the people of the coastal southeast, inhabiting what is now coastal Georgia and Florida, along with the Native Americans who inhabited the American West Coast, shared many cultural similarities with the eastern woodland people, especially their combination of the agricultural and hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Additionally, the eastern woodlanders shared some cultural similarities with the southwestern Indians, especially when it came to gender-based divisions of labor. Both groups made women responsible for agriculture. Eastern woodlanders lived in tree bark longhouses, called lodges or wigwams, which could be taken apart and moved, depending on the season. Eastern woodlanders also traveled across the region by water, using canoes made from birch bark or hollowed-out tree trunks, called dugout canoes. Eastern woodlanders hunted deer and turkeys, and caught fish and gathered crustaceans, adding protein to their diets, since they, unlike the Native Americans of Mesoamerica and South America, did not practice animal husbandry, the raising of animals for food, milk, or fibers. Warfare was an important part of the lifeways of the eastern woodland peoples, who fought each other seasonally to capture resources and to take captives. These captives, if they were women or children, would be adopted into the tribe, but military-aged male captives were often killed in ritual sacrifices, often by being burned alive. These torturous executions gave the families of warriors who had been killed in battle a chance to take ceremonial vengeance for their lost brothers, husbands, sons, and fathers. Some of these peoples also included cannibalism in these rituals, allowing the surviving warriors to consume the power of their executed captives. While these rituals seem brutal, even barbaric to us today, they helped to prevent long-standing blood feuds between tribal groups. They also disincentivized the eastern woodlands peoples from seeking to conquer enemy tribes in battle, by giving them the chance to experience small-scale personal vengeance on captured warriors. Eastern woodlanders recognized that a destroyed enemy could not be fought again, and thus could not provide additional victory spoils or captives in the future. Over time, small eastern woodlands bands began to join together, creating the large tribes and confederations that Europeans first witnessed when they arrived in America. Here are some material examples of the kinds of weapons that the eastern woodlands people would have used. Ranged weapons like bows and arrows would have been very important. Also, knives, hatchets, often known as tomahawks, were important parts of the military equipment used by eastern woodlands peoples. And also these clubs are very important. These clubs, of course, are actually very, very deadly, very sophisticated melee weapons. And weapons like this would have allowed certain eastern woodlands peoples to build larger confederations by defeating their foes. Like the Mound Builders and the southwestern Native Americans, the eastern Woodlands people had complex spiritual beliefs. They gave reverence to the dead, and they engaged in rituals that would protect their crops and ensure that they grew well. The eastern Woodlands people used tobacco in their religious rituals. Their tobacco had a lower nicotine content than the leaf that is commonly smoked in America today, and it probably had hallucinogenic properties as well, somewhat like cannabis. In addition to the use of tobacco, beads were also an important part of the spiritual and social rituals of the eastern Woodlands people. These beads would be used in spiritual rituals, but they would also be fashioned into what were called wampum belts. And these belts would be used in social rituals and basically diplomatic treaties between various eastern Woodlands peoples. They would give these wampum belts, they would exchange wampum belts between each other as a symbol of peace and of alliance. Here's a close-up of a wampum belt featuring geometric figures, probably humans and dogs. And of course, the figures are clasping hands, symbolizing that these wampum belts were meant to be tokens of peace and friendship between eastern Woodlands people. Here are some examples of indigenous people modeling various types of beads. These beads, of course, were used in spiritual rituals, they were used in diplomatic rituals, but they were also used for personal adornment as well and for decoration to show off one's social status, for example. They also could have been used to signal group membership or tribal membership. Because they moved seasonally, the eastern woodland people did not believe in the owning of land. They believed that people had the right to work the land, either hunting or growing crops on it, but the idea that land should be divided and permanently parceled out to individual owners, as was more common in European cultures, was alien to them. These differing views on land use would lead to future struggles between Native Americans and Europeans. In the American Midwest and Great Plains, Native American life was profoundly different before the introduction of the horse by the Spanish colonizers. Before the arrival of horses, the Plains Indians, the ancestors of people like the Lakota Sioux, were semi-nomadic horticulturalists, growing small gardens and hunting large game, primarily bison. Here is some modern artistic renditions of how Native Americans of the Great Plains would have hunted bison before the adoption of horses. Native Americans had already domesticated dogs before the European arrival, and they would have used dogs, canines, these companion species, to basically act as hunting partners as they hunted bison. Seen here in this image in the center. Native Americans also may have disguised themselves, perhaps as wolves or dogs, in order to frighten the bison into stampeding. The frightened bison would then stampede off of cliffs and down into deep valleys where they would either be killed or severely injured by the fall. And Native American hunters would then finish off the bison that were at the bottom of the valley. These sophisticated and ingenious methods were used before the arrival of horses, which allowed Native American hunters to keep up with the bison in terms of speed. The bison, of course, are very, very fast, very strong prey animals. Here is a image of a Native American from the Great Plains with a dog. Dogs were used not just as hunting partners and as guards for settlements, but also as beasts of burden on the Pre-Columbian Great Plains. Dogs would be loaded up with all types of equipment. These are called travois. The dogs would drag these travois, which were loaded with all types of equipment, similar to sled dog teams, like those used in what is now Alaska, for example. This is a artistic rendition of what pre-Columbian Great Plains settlements would have looked like. You can see they have these beehive-shaped structures, which look like a mix of eastern woodlands wigwams and then the later Great Plains teepees. They're sort of a transitional architectural style. Of course, many features of Great Plains life would change significantly after the introduction of horses. This is a recreation of what a pre-Columbian style Great Plains building would have looked like. There's a lot more grasses and plant materials being used to construct these buildings. With the adoption of horses, Great Plains hunters were able to much more easily and effectively hunt bison, and that gave them much easier access to bison hides, allowing them to build the bison hide teepees that we're more familiar with today. This is a Great Plains style peace pipe, once again highlighting the importance of tobacco consumption, ritualized tobacco consumption for Native Americans from a variety of regions and environments within North America. Here are some examples of Great Plains Native American military technology. We have types of tomahawks that were used, and then we also have different types of arrows and arrowheads that were also employed in these hunting parties, but also in war bands as well. Native Americans on the Great Plains also made clubs. These clubs, however, were probably made after the arrival of Europeans, and the base of these clubs were probably actually made from the stocks of muskets or long firearms. In fact, this type of club is often called a gunstock club. So it shows how Native Americans of the Great Plains adapted their lifeways after the European arrival. They adopted horses, they changed their hunting patterns, and they also changed the way some of their weapons were made as well. Without horses, the Plains people developed some ingenious methods for hunting bison and other fast and powerful game animals. The Plains hunters would camouflage themselves in buffalo skins and trick the bison into coming close and letting down their guard, where they could be more easily killed with spears and bows and arrows. They would also drive the bison off cliffs, where their prey would fall to its death. In this slide, you can see an image of Plains people driving buffalo off a cliff, although you'll see them using horses. Because of the difficulty and danger associated with hunting bison, both before and after the introduction of horses, Plains hunters found uses for every part of the buffalo. Its meat and organs were eaten, its blood could be used to make paint, and its bones and skins could be used to fabricate clothing and shelters, portable tent lodges called teepees. Before the arrival of horses, the Plains Indians used dogs as beasts of burden to help them move their settlements. Horses were much stronger and faster than dogs and could bear riders, allowing Plains hunters to hunt bison from horseback as well as travel greater distances during the year. In this way, the Plains people actually became less sedentary over time, in contrast to other Native American peoples we have discussed before, whose lifeways became more static over time. We have covered a tremendous amount of information about the people who inhabited the Americas before the arrival of Europeans, and we've really only scratched the surface of this subject. As you can see, Native American culture and lifeways varied greatly depending on region and time, from the first Paleo Indians to the Mississippian, Eastern Woodland, and Plains cultures that Europeans witnessed when they arrived in North America. Native American culture was incredibly diverse and not a monolith. Indeed, the idea that Amerindians were a single people was a European construction. For most of their history, America's first peoples did not think of themselves as a single ethnic or racial group. Native Americans would not begin to think of themselves this way until, at the earliest, the 19th century. But we will discuss this change in attitude in future videos. Even though Native American peoples had drastically different life ways, based on the environments in which they lived and the resources they had access to, I hope that during this video you also saw there were some important commonalities between these disparate Amerindian groups. One commonality between Native Americans was the prevalence of religious beliefs that emphasized humanity's connection with nature. The people of the Southwest, the mound building and Mississippian cultures, and the eastern Woodlands peoples practiced rituals that honored the earth to ensure that it provided rains to water their crops, especially maize. What I also hoped that you saw was that Native American gender relations were different than those of the Europeans who migrated to the Americas. Although a gendered labor division existed amongst Native Americans, women had responsibilities that were unheard of amongst European cultures until the 20th century. I also hope that you saw that Native Americans, like Europeans, also held and continue to hold their dead in high regard. They had important rituals surrounding the commemoration and burial of their deceased, even ancestors from thousands of years ago, like the Kennewick Man. Finally, I hope that you saw that warfare was common and even an important part of life for Native Americans, especially those that lived in the Mississippian cultures and amongst the eastern Woodlanders. I bring up this point because many people, from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds, operate under the assumption that life for Native Americans before the arrival of Europeans was idyllic and an Eden-like paradise. In fact, life was very difficult for many indigenous people as climates changed, wars persisted, and commoners labored to support the elite. This belief that Native American life was idyllic was often driven by the quote-unquote noble savage stereotype. The noble savage stereotype was an ethnocentric belief developed by Europeans, which alleged that Native Americans were weak and childlike, living in a perfect land without having to work to survive. This mentality was used to justify wars against Native American tribes, encroaching on the land that they occupied, and eventually the acculturation of Native Americans in favor of European customs. We'll talk about all these issues in later videos.